When you're talking about redlining and the way that there is no distinction made between sort of Black neighborhoods that have solid housing stock and neighborhoods that have poor housing stock, there's an interesting confluence of things that happens in Jackson Ward, right? With urban renewal, there's the desire to update and modernize and clear slums. There's the desire to also create in their place sort of engines of profit and wealth. And building, low-cost residences is not the best way to maximize the value of the land for the people that are investing in the land. But it also strikes me when you think about Jackson Ward that city planners, have sort of gerrymandered. Like Jackson Ward is sitting just in the northern part of sort of the center core of the city. This is valuable land, and city planners are like looking at this land covetously. And Black neighborhoods that are are sitting there and they're fixed there. And it strikes me that when you think about city planning in Richmond over the first half of the 20th century, and beyond the first half of the 20th century, there is this sort of desire, and you see this sort of renewal to just carve out slowly sort of pieces of this land, Navy Hill, Jackson Ward, to repurpose it and to think about ways to push Black residents out of those neighborhoods. And
yeah, Adam, the modern city was built on the backs of Black people. Is what, right? It's just no other way. If a city had a sizable Black population, it was built on the Black, literally, right? Modernity, like somebody's got to pay the cost, right? And who pays the cost in a city like Richmond? But Black people, right? The stroke of political genius, right? The kind of Machiavellian frenzy of disenfranchisement that emerges in the early 20th century is what allows for these people to come in and essentially do whatever the hell they want. Cities are a series of human decisions with political implications, right? And if people are not at the table, they can be abused. And this isn't the sexy version of American history. We whenever we start talking about racism in the United States, people automatically go to lynching and the kind of visible representations of white evil, right? That's what we need to see. It's like, but wait a minute, there's something else more subtle, right? That once I always tell my students when I teach urban history, what I'm gonna talk to you about this semester cannot be unseen, but you won't recognize it at first. But when we get through this semester, you will never be able to negotiate an urban space without thinking about precisely what you just articulated, Adam. Right? Yeah,
well, it's interesting. I mean, in the case of the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, you're right. Like much of this is mundane and legal, right? Segregation is legal. Voting restriction is legal. That puts power in the hands of white elites that are then making decisions that have profound consequences. But sorry, go ahead. Do you want to?
That's what we struggle with, right? We need to pathologize evil. It has to be like something, that's beyond the pale. But what we're really talking about here is the banality of evil, like how commonplace it was to just completely just and purposefully neglect generations of people from the building blocks of upward mobility that might allow them down the line. Right? It is wasteful. Right. And that's what I try to get my father used to say this in some ways. He used to say, how many Einsteins have we lost in public housing? If the assumption is that people in poor communities are there because they're stupid, then it all makes sense. But what if they're not? What if there's potential there? And what did these historical actors do? How many people who might have come up with, some profound idea to move us forward, right, were lost at the altar of these plans that were they were designed to benefit a handful of people. It is absolutely amazing how people don't recognize how commonplace this was and how commonplace the evilness of it was, if you want to call it evil, right? I mean, it's just blatant disregard for, we are talking about 50 to 60% of the city's population. How is that a sustainable plan to move a city forward, right? And here's the irony of it. When African Americans take over the reins of city council in Richmond in the 1970s, their white counterparts are blaming them for not being able to make the city livable with no historical awareness or ability to turn around and say, well, how did segregation actually pave the road, right, that made Richmond an unlivable city in the 1970s and the 1980s? Nope, they blame Black people. It's just sinister. You can't think of it anything else. It's just sinister, right?
I think the place where violence becomes important, though, or the place is that you also see that when these everyday acts of sort of the maintenance of racial hierarchy, when they break down, then there is that backup plan. With Richmond Petersburg Turnpike, the city council, like the city actually votes not to construct the turnpike through Jackson Ward, and then a new plan is mobilized in the legislature.
That's right.
So I think it's both, right? It's that there is both a banal system of everyday acts of appropriation and maintenance, but there is also the willingness and the recourse to more extreme measures when those banal systems start to fall down or fray or are significantly challenged.
Yeah, that's the beauty of, the segregated political system, is there are all of these kind of safeguards against it not working for the benefit of those it was designed to work for. So if a city like Richmond would vote against having the freeway constructed through Jackson Ward, they could always turn to the state legislature, by the way, to do the dirty work, in large part because it was made up of a handful of like-minded individuals. I mean, you can't think about it as anything other than it's just the anti-democratic face of American 20th century history. So much so, I mean, by 1960, I think it was by 1967, 60% of white Americans lived in the suburbs, right? The unintended consequence of this is, we deal with this even to this day, where people begin to think that these are, that people live in these neighborhoods is a matter of choice. It's by design, right? So what it means is, by the early 20th century, you get kids coming to college from racially homogenous neighborhoods, right? I mean, literally, where diversity is a dirty word, because all they know are people that look like them. This lays the modern framework for every single inner city and urban problem we are facing in the 20th century is laid right here, right? You can explain you can explain George Floyd, you can explain all the stuff we're dealing with right now with recourse to this history. It actually matters when we're trying to decode and deconstruct what the problems are in the United States in the 21st century, in 2021
right.
and 2020.
And as you point out, like all of this is built on an anti-democratic foundation of disenfranchisement, which is important because, I think when a lot of people look at what's happening currently with people look at the Trump administration and they say, well, this is unprecedented. This is sort of antithetical to America's democratic traditions. This is it, right?
No, it's not.
It is very consistent, right? But it's important to understand that, I think.
This is what, American political development is not like some kind of teleological arc. It's a pendulum, right? Where moments of permissiveness and progress are often followed by eras of deep restriction and people reorganizing the nature of government to meet the demands of the few. What happened after the Civil War, right? What happened after Jacksonian democracy? What happened after the Civil Rights Movement, right? Anybody that see Donald Trump coming on the heels of Barack Obama doesn't understand how American political development works. And by the way, which is to say nothing of the nature in which people spend the better portion of the twilight of the 20th century designing districts around these racially homogenous communities that were purposely built with federal policies, right? To create a political system that is shockingly less about ideology and more about where someone lives, right? It's the level of gerrymandering around these communities.
Right.
Are you kidding
me? People in general don't like to make sacrifices or give up things that benefits, privileges that they have. And the construction of our cities, which was very much intentional, was to build pockets of wealth, pockets where people have good schools, they have resources, they have real stakes in preserving those benefits, and places that don't. And our political system is that then people then vote to defend those pockets of wealth.
Well, because the key, right? the key to the net worth of most Americans isn't, stock profile or
Right.
economic or diversification of it's home ownership, right? So what happens to people who are frozen out of this system? What you get is like I said, if the federal government is encouraging people to live in single family nuclear homes during the mid 20th century, and African Americans are generally excluded from that, right, because of the kind of races embedded in the creation of the culture of homeownership. What does that mean for the twilight of the 20th century and the early 21st century? It means that they don't have the accumulated wealth of their white counterparts. Somebody that moves into Levittown, New York, right, in the 1950s is a middle class person. They ain't now, right? Because
Yeah.
Levittown, New York is prime real estate. That's you're sitting on $1 million investment right there, if not more. Well, so who?
Yeah, the sociologist Thomas Shapiro estimated several years back that by 2020, so right now, the accumulated wealth of sort of federal housing policy was $9 trillion, right? So $9 trillion of wealth
That's
being
right.
brought into nearly entirely the white community, right? Only 2% of federal housing loans go to Black communities, and mostly those are like segregated communities in the South.
2%, right? And think of it this way: this is where things really get sinister. Virtually all African American communities are redlined despite their socioeconomic standing. And there were any number of African Americans who could have afforded homes in the 1950s in segregated white suburbs. Literally, it's not as if there
Right.
weren't Black people with money, right? So what does that do for them? What happens to the Black middle class because of these rules, right? And what happens to Black upward mobility because of these rules? See, we have a tendency to think that Black neighborhoods are poor and broke because that's the way they look now. There were Black middle class people in the 1940s and 50s who could have moved out to the suburbs with their white counterparts and came up, but they were disallowed from doing that. So what it does is it means that there's a kind of proximal nature to African American life. I was the richest kid on a poor block. I grew up in a two-parent household. My parents had money, and every poor kid in the neighborhood knew my parents had money. So it creates a strange dynamic even within the African American community itself, where Black middle class people are forced, as a matter of consequence, to live around poverty. And believe me, there is tension within the community because of the kind of proximal space. We have a tendency to think about segregated communities as these racial utopias, and sure, they were thriving, but they had problems. Churchill, Jackson Ward, Fulton, Navy Hill didn't even have the types of things that we would associate with modernity, right? By the 1950s. They didn't bring in modern sewage systems into Churchill until like the 1950s and 60s. So what you have are people with money who have to live around this. And then you have people without money who have to suffer through this. It's otherworldly when you think about, right? What these communities had to endure because of these rules.
Right.
Right.
To your point, I think I may be wrong about this, but it's close. That in St. Louis alone, the study showed that 80,000 Black families would have qualified for home loans if they had been white, right? They hadn't been denied on the basis of race. So we're talking about tens of thousands of people in one city, and this is happening all over the country in every single city.
That's
we're
right.
talking about millions of people that would have had these ladders to wealth, as you say, the primary means of wealth for most
right.
families.
It's tragic. It's an American tragedy in some ways. And what's even more tragic is not that upwardly mobile African Americans are disallowed from living in upwardly mobile spaces, but even working class and poor folks are disallowed from being upwardly mobile because of these rules. So I mean, those African Americans that do make it through this are nothing short of remarkable given the rules, the amount of obstacles that people have to endure to overcome, right? This deeply unfair system is nothing short of remarkable.